Hey, what's up? I'm Steve. Today, I want to show you how I change the background in my product photography so that a shot will go from looking like this to this. Let's do it. So right off the bat, you're saying, Steve, well, if you're going to change the background, why wouldn't you just roll out a green seamless? Well, oranges and pineapple, they're going to stain that. The coconut and the chocolate, it's going to take a while to get that all stylized. So the ability to provide flexibility for our clients to say we can put it on a blue, we can put it on a green, we can put it on an orange, that's what I want to show you how I did that. It's a common scenario, and this is how I approach resolving that. I want to show you real quickly how I did it. So if you're experienced and knowledgeable in Photoshop, you're going to get it. But if you want to stick around, I'm going to explain it even further. Because a lot of times people will say, hey, let's get right into it, and then they don't. So I'm going to get right into it, and then I'm going to give you a little bit more information on the back end. Here is the shot that we took in studio, straight out of camera. This is the shot. I shouldn't say straight out of camera. It's got some processing to it, right? And I should also mention that I have loose selections here, but I want to, again, just give you the idea of how I go about making these changes so that hopefully it'll help you so that you can think about making those changes or at least approaching shots similar to this. Here it is in green. The biggest thing for me is making it look realistic. So preserving shadows and then recreating reflected light onto the product. So if we go through and look at this stack of what I have here, I have a background color, right? This is a smart object, and that's kind of key. A smart object that just contains a color adjustment layer, a solid color. So the real benefit here, and the way that I've set up this file is if I double click on this smart object, and I come in here to my solid color layer, and let's say I want to change this to like a nice pale blue. I say okay, I'm going to save this, I'm going to close it, boom. Real simple. And not only did I change the color of my background, but I also changed the color of the shadows reflecting onto my products because of what I have set up here and what I have set up here. So this one, if I turn this on and off, you'll see this is for the container. So here is no color on the container. Here's the color on the container. And all I did simply was use that same smart object. I duplicated it, right, with Command J to duplicate it. And then I just added some masks to say, only let this color show up on the edges of that product where it naturally would. I did the same thing over here on my flavor cues, right? So here it is, no color. There it is with color. And you see it, that one's much more subtle, right? Because, well, mainly, I don't want to make my pineapple and orange look green because that's not really appealing. But also because naturally it wouldn't reflect a whole lot of light. It would reflect some light. The other thing that I did over down here is I preserved my shadows. So you can see here are no shadows and here are the shadows. And all that is simply is cutting out the layer, extracting it, setting it to a multiply, and in this case it's still at 100% opacity and fill. So I'm getting those exact natural colors that would have been reflected on that blue background. Last two parts where I added in a gradient, and you'll see if I zoom out a little bit here before and after. Having it just flat like this looks flat, right? It doesn't look real. So when I add in this highlight, the whole idea with this gradient is that it's going to be very similar to what I actually photographed in studio. So I'm mimicking the lighting. And if you didn't photograph an image, and let's say you're just manipulating a shot, just look at the direction of the shadows and that'll tell you where the light's coming from. So in this case, I knew that my key light or my main light was coming from the back top left. So that's where I put this gradient coming from. And then the last piece of the puzzle here is putting grain on that recreated color. Because even though cameras are really good nowadays, they still have a little bit of grain in them, even at ISO 100. What I want to do is anytime I'm adding in some graphics or effects, I want to make sure that I'm adding a little bit of noise to them so that it looks like it was photographed. That's how I would go about doing this. And the real benefit here is that it's quick and easy for you to change the color to whatever the client wants. For example, let's say they say, Steve, we want this green as the background. We want to test that out. Cool, no problem. Let's go ahead and go to our color picker here. We're going to sample this. Here's my hexadecimal. I'm going to select that, copy it, say okay, come down to my smart object, my color layer, paste it, okay, save it, close it. And now not only is the background changed to that exact color, but also the shadows have changed. So that's how I go about doing this. Now, if you're not well versed in Photoshop, and this is something newer to you, let's walk through some of those steps together right now, okay? So let's kind of break down this file and dive in a little bit deeper. Again, first half, down and dirty, here's what I did. Now let me show you a little bit more and maybe dive into some of those whys, okay? There's always 5 different ways to do it. This is the way I do it. So I want to show you how I extract the shadow and how I would start to paint in some of that reflected light on the objects. I'm not going to do the entire thing. I just want to give you an example of what that would look like, right? this selection, it all starts with a selection here. And many times you might find that the pen tool is best, sometimes a polygonal lasso, or even a quick select, right? So this was a combination of quick select and pen tool. Typically organic objects like oranges, coconut, stuff like that, you can get away with using some quick select stuff, right? Because it finds those edges pretty nicely for you. And objects that are a little bit more rigid, like these containers, the pen tool is gonna be your best friend. Now, you might say, well, Steve, that pineapple's kind of rigid, but also organic. You're right. So pen tool might also work really well on that, and the chocolate over there. Really, I don't wanna make this about selection tools, but just know that, like anything, a good selection is a good foundation. Once we've made that selection, we can then start building and manipulating from there. If I just made a selection of this and cut it out and put on a new layer below it, this is what we got. And it looks kind of gross. It doesn't look real. There's no shadows, and look at how bright those highlights are on those containers. That's not convincing anyone that this was actually the background that was there, right? Now, obviously, if we add in our gradient, it kind of helps a little bit, and the grain, right? But that's not really selling anything. So we need to add in those shadows. How do we do it? So I'm gonna go back to this layer right over here, and let's just call this subject. Give it some names now. And with this, what I wanna do is I'm just gonna grab the polygonal lasso tool. I'm gonna hide the mask by holding shift and clicking on that mask. I'm gonna make a selection of anywhere I would see that cast shadow or those drop shadows. So right about over there, that's looking good. Now what I want to do is extract that. I want to put it on its own layer. So I have a selection, I have my layer selected, Command J does just that, puts it on its own layer. So I'm going to rename this shadow. I want to move that below my subject, right? Because the shadow would be underneath it. So Command left bracket is going to do that for me, or you could just drag it down. So now if I bring this mask back, you can see what we've got, right? It still looks gross. We need to fix it. We need to change our blend mode. So with the shadow layer selected, I'm just simply gonna set this to multiply. Voila, that's basically it. Many cases you might find that if your background isn't perfectly white, or if it's still a little bit gray, you might have to adjust your levels so that some parts of it become white, because that's the trick here, right? Is that white, when you set your blend mode to multiply, white disappears. So you don't wanna see any white. And just as an example, right, if I started pulling some of this back, and it actually looks like, yeah, so if your background looked more like this, right, which sometimes happens if it's a light gray, you want to adjust your levels so that it goes completely white, so then therefore it's completely invisible. And what you're left with are just those dark area shadows. Well, what about getting that green light reflected onto our subject? So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this smart object and I'm gonna duplicate it so that any change that I make to the original smart object, or really any of them, it's reflected on all of them. So let me explain the difference there. If I just do Command J, now BG color, these two are the same. They're linked together. So if I change the color of one of them, right, let's do that. Let's go back to the, let's do a pink. Cool. Save that, close it. Both of them changed, right? So there's a difference in a smart object. If I were to right click on this and choose new smart object via copy, that's different. This one is new, so I'm gonna call this, just so I can keep track of things, blue. So if I change this to blue, you'll see what's gonna happen here. This is independent from that purple. So I'm gonna close that, and you can see now this is its own smart object. So making sure that you're using Command J to duplicate that so it's the same. And that's really important, because that's the whole thing about this trick, right? Is that it saves you time. So once you figure out what color you want to make sure that light is reflected onto your subject. Cool. Let's call this container shadow, or reflect, however you'd want to name that. So now I want to get this into position so that I can start painting this color on top of my subject. And that's really the trick. And it takes a little bit of time. And again, there's so many different ways to do the same thing in Photoshop. I want to just show you very simply how you could do it without diving in too deep. So if I Option click on the add a layer mask, what that does is that adds a black mask, which conceals. So the trick, if you're not familiar with masks, white reveals, black conceals. Kind of a nice little quick trick. This purple is not showing up anywhere, but what I want it to do is I want it to show up on my subject. So if I grab a brush tool, right, and I make it a fairly big and soft brush, which you can come in here and adjust I'm gonna set my hardness to 0. My size in this case just happens to be 600. And if I start painting, you can see I'm adding color onto the edges, that's the only place I really want to do it, because that's where the light would really get pulled in. Adding color onto the edges of my subject, and it looks real sloppy. You'd be like, Steve, this is what you do for a living? It is. But hold on, let me show you. So I'm adding it on layer by layer. My opacity is at 50%, so I can kind of gradually put it in there. You could adjust all of your settings. Maybe you want to play with your flow. So I'm gonna really just put that in there. Now, it looks gross. We gotta clean it up, right? Thankfully, we have a mask that we already created from our subject, which will allow us to do just that. So if I command click on this, I need to add this mask onto the layer that already has a mask. So how do you do that? Well, the trick is, I'm gonna deselect, you actually take that layer and you put it in a group. So you just group itself. Command G. Now add this selection to the group. So now my mask is nice and clean and it's only around my subject. And now what I can do is start to control only where the purple is on the actual items that I want it to be on. The other thing that I need to do is I need to change this blend mode. Right now it's on normal and it doesn't look believable. I'm gonna set that to multiply. Now it's starting to look a little bit more realistic. But what I need to do is I need to come in here and I need to clean up this mask. So it's a little bit tedious, slightly time consuming, but at the end of the day, you're gonna end up with something that's gonna look nice and realistic, and that's gonna save you time when you know you have to change the colors over and over and over again. So I'm just gonna clean this up here, make this a little bit smaller so that way it's not touching my fruit, it's only touching my container. Same thing over here, I wanna get this off of the chocolate, just on that container. So I'm cleaning it up anywhere that I don't want that purple to end up. And if you ever need to check it, you can use the backslash key, and that will show you where your mask is, and if it's hitting an object, like right here, I can see it's hitting the chocolate, so I can just make sure I mask that out. Good. And over here. Good. So in this case, what we're looking at, anything that's red is not getting purple. Good, that's looking pretty nice. So hit that slash key again to turn that off. And I also don't want it really hitting the top of my containers over here because it wouldn't really get absorbed that much. And what's nice about this method is you can start to have a nice finesse and control. So I'm gonna set my flow to 20%. And what I'm gonna do is just start painting away gently at the top here. Just so that it's not really at the top of my container, because the light source is from above, so that would actually be bright, right? Whereas the color, when the light hits the surface, it bounces that color back up. So that's really the only place where you would see it coming about. And if I take this and maybe dial this opacity back a little bit, now I can start to get it to be in a place that's a little bit more realistic. So if I turn that on and off, you'll see super bright white, purple. And again, because this smart object is linked to the original, if I change the color of either one of these, both of them will change to that color. Let me just demonstrate that again. Let's go yellow this time. Let's make it like a nice, yeah, pale. It's springtime, right? Boom. And that color is now around my subject. You would do the same process for your fruit down here at the bottom, or in this case, it's not that bad as is, but you would do the same process. You would make a selection, you would paint in the areas where you wanted that color to show up. Mainly it's gonna really show up in the shadow tones when you set your blend mode to multiply. You can play around with different blend modes by all means. I like multiply in this case. And that's a really nice way for you to be able to change the color after the fact. So when you're having those conversations with a client and they say, you know, we want this on this color and this on this color, part of my job is to figure out, well, okay, what's gonna be the best way to approach that logistically? What's the best use of our studio time? So if we're setting this up, stylizing it, and if we have to do that 3 times, that's not a good use of time. As long as the conversation's had to say, hey, client, are you okay if we just do the color in post? We'll get it to be about 90% of the way there in that color, especially if this is just for social, right? It's different if you're doing a full-blown banner and you're doing some print ads. Maybe you want to actually photograph it on that color. Maybe it's really worth it for those hero shots, right? For those major shots. But when you think about the amount of content that's created on a regular basis and you want to be efficient with that, this is how I would approach it. So I hope that was helpful, insightful. Any thoughts, feedback, or comments, please let me know. This idea came about because people asked for it. I did a really quick 30-second Reels kind of overview of this process, and people said, ooh, how'd you do that? Can you make a tutorial? So that's why I did this. If there are more questions, let me know. Until the next one, we'll see you.